Joining us today from London is Marta Foresti, Director at the Overseas Development Institute, a global think tank for peace and sustainability. Marta, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now, the migration narrative in the Mediterranean has been strongly polarized for years now. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic has intensified this polarization? And if so, how?
So as you say, the narrative around migration in the Mediterranean region, and in particular between Africa and Europe, has been polarized and politically difficult to engage with for a number of years. And yet there are some important lessons that we learned even before the COVID pandemic. And I think it will be key to learn from them to make sure that we adapt to this new reality of life with COVID, as most countries in the region work towards a recovery. What we knew about migration narratives, and particularly about public attitudes towards migration in the countries, in the regions, certainly in Europe, but also increasingly in Africa and the Middle East, is that contrary to what most people believe, the public attitudes towards migration are not that polarized, meaning that the attitudes that people have are not as negative as one might assume, given the political debates in a lot of the countries in the region. And so while, particularly during political campaigns, people become very interested in migration, and migration certainly has a strong political salience in a number of countries. And there is no doubt that the public in a number of countries are very worried about uncontrolled migration, illegal migration, being invaded by migrants. This is in no way, is not particularly entrenched, meaning that people don't have inherent negative views about migrants, about the other, and actually have a real appetite to try to see this problem resolved and addressed, including with fairness and a greater degree of humanity. A good case in point is a country like the UK, which is obviously not in the Mediterranean region, but until recently very much linked to Europe, where during the campaign for the Brexit referendum, the views obviously, a lot of it revolved around immigration issues, and yet polls since the referendum showed very clearly that the views of the British public towards migration has become much more positive, and interestingly, with a particular trend ever since the so-called Windrush scandal, that so people being mistreated because of unfair immigration policies, and then public attitudes becoming much more open to the need to address migration in fairer ways. So this is a bit of a conundrum. So we know that it's a topic where people are fundamentally open-minded. In the vast majority, in almost all countries in Europe, the vast majority of people are undecided. Roughly 50% of the population does not hold particularly strong negative or positive views about migration. They want to be reassured about how it's going to be handled, and they have worries. Sometimes they're called the so-called anxious middle. So people that do not have strong views, that want mostly to be reassured and better informed. And yet, at every turn in political campaigns, we've seen nationalist politicians and parties really making immigration the centerpiece of political campaigns, and in most cases being very successful at it. So this requires some thinking and some innovative ways to try to live with this knowledge in the way we think of the narrative that we use.
Exactly, and as this requires some extra thinking, let me get a bit deeper into this. So if we look at the official data from Frontex, we can see how irregular migration has significantly decreased, especially since 2015. And as you said earlier, research suggests that public attitudes on migration are not becoming more negative. Instead, they have been stable for at least a decade. Nonetheless, the public debate on migration, especially within the Mediterranean, seems to focus mainly on the negative side of the overall phenomenon. Now, you explain the problem, like How can you explain this paradox, and what are the main findings of ODI on this?
So I think actually this paradox has become very apparent during the, in the early stages during the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, and I think is now evolving rapidly as most countries adapt to a period of difficult recovery. So what we're seeing in this last few weeks is two things that once again appear contradictory, or there are somewhat point to different directions. On the one hand, we've seen a number of countries getting even more preoccupied about controlling borders. I think we can all anticipate that in the near future there will be less opportunity for people to meet and more anxieties about keeping countries safe and border secure. At the same time, in a number of countries, we have, people seem to have woken up to the reality that migrant workers are indeed key and essential workers in our economies and societies, both in a situation where, in the health sectors during an emergency, but also increasingly recognized, particularly in the agricultural sector, in the care economy, the delivery drivers, all the people that are keeping our countries and our societies afloat and safe, both during the emergency and in the recovery. So to me, that points to one particular an important finding, and is that if you ask people how they feel about a migrant, a person that is other, different from themselves, and somebody has different characteristics and does not have the same origin, is not born in the same place, people have strong, tend to have views about what kind of migrants they like and they're prepared to accept. But if you ask people whether they want their communities to remain safe and services to be delivered and people to be healthy, people are very much in favor to make that happen and to have reforms that are conducive to that end. And so all of a sudden, the fact that migrant workers can be pretty key to achieve these objectives, I think is an opportunity to help people look at the phenomena from a completely different viewpoint. So not necessarily, and this is my challenge, framing migration in positive ways or looking at the success stories of migrants, but rather breaking down the barrier between the migrants and us, and talk much more openly about our collective future as a key to get, to get out of the pandemic and to overcome the challenges of COVID, where countries will need to think at new and adapted ways of recoveries, where all of us can benefit and all of us need to play a part.
Okay, so you talked about migrant key workers, also in a recent blog that you authored, an ode to key workers, if I'm not wrong. And also you talk about breaking barriers. Now, as you mentioned, like during the pandemic, the role of these so-called key migrant workers, migrant key workers, has been very relevant, has been very discussed in both international and national media. So you mentioned the impact of positive stories, but you suggested something more in detail. What is the importance of raising awareness of sometimes these hidden aspects of migration, like the fact that many economies, especially in Europe, depend on these very specific profiles that are fundamental for the functioning of our society? Can this actually help shift the attention from the negative to the positive side of migration? What is your recommendation and your findings on this?
So I think this can help us enormously. In fact, I've written, since that original blog where I spotted this as something that in fact was about to happen in so many countries, and what I've been thinking since, given how much this topic has resonates now in different parts of the world, and how many innovations, how many reforms, how many new initiatives that we are actually very actively tracking at ODI are, week by week, are developing, all aiming to find practical ways to recognize the value and the contribution of migrant workers as essential key workers in the COVID response. But I think that the real opportunity and the key insights for this experience is that the reason why this has, this resonates with the public in so many contexts is because key workers are all of us. So the migrant workers are part of now, an awareness about the value and the contribution of a broader set of people who are members of our community, that are the heroes, the people that in this country, in the UK, we clap for every Thursday night, the people who are keeping us alive. And they are, the migrant members, the migrant workers are part of this community. So they're now, they are us. We are in this endeavor together. And I think the key challenge is to maintain this sense of collective endeavor for the recovery and for the future. So these are workers that were not just essential in a crisis, in a moment of emergencies, when doctors were flown in from different parts of the world. The delivery drivers, the care workers, in fact, the agricultural workers, which have been in the spotlight in Italy in the last few days, are essential for our economies and societies going forward. So yes, I think that's the insights and the opportunity, is to shift the narrative away from us and them, and to shift the narrative towards us and the collective destiny and the collective purpose of this next phase. So I would suggest that it's less an issue or less a matter of spotting, putting a spotlight on the positive stories, and once again trying to suggest, as a reaction to the negative views, that there is a more, the other side of the coin is the positive story that shows that migrants are good. The challenge is to now shift the conversation towards migrants are all of us. And there's, breaking down this barrier of diversity, where the definition and the label of migrant is one that immediately indicates that it's somebody born elsewhere with a different culture, typically with a different skin color, with a different set of traditions, whereas now they're us.
In this very regards, I'd like to ask you a specific question that comes out from a research that was actually done in the UK about the so-called Salah effect. I'm referring to the notorious Liverpool FC footballer Mohamed Salah, one of the best footballers in the world today, of Egyptian origin, a devoted Muslim, somebody very discreet, who has had a tremendous impact in society. And in fact, researchers basically have analyzed how since Salah joined Liverpool and pretty much started helping the team, winning even the Champions League most recently, there has been a corresponding decrease in hate crime and hate speech on social networks, exactly from people that usually are Liverpool supporters. So they actually went really in detail at looking into the areas where the most Liverpool FC supporters were, and managed to prove that the performance of a champion of migration, as we can call him in this case, has actually had a societal impact. Now, citing this example, apart from the ordinary heroes that you mentioned in shifting this debate from migration crisis to migration capital, what could be the role of celebrities and testimonials in breaking these barriers?
So the potential for celebrities, for successful people, of which, as we all know, there are many in the migrant communities around the world, because consistently, if you look at the most successful entrepreneurs, at the most, no matter in which field of sports, business, music you look at, you can always find migrants who are examples of success stories. And we know, research also tells us that migrants, people who move from their home and adapt to life in different contexts and countries, tend to be very resilient individuals that have, are driven, strong, motivated, as well as often being typically young and healthy, which means also that, as we know, they tend not to be big burdens on societies. So there is definitely scope to do more, particularly in the public in the public space with, I think, not just celebrities, but generally leaders in different fields taking more of a stand and actually speaking out and contributing, both as migrants themselves in the debate, but also, for example, business leaders that could be much more vocal about the fact that their businesses thrive because of the contribution of workers of different orders in different sectors. It's been fascinating to see, for example, the effect that having a politician in Italy becoming emotional about a reform that she's been driven because she herself, not necessarily as a migrant in that case, but as a worker in unfair conditions has experienced. And so being able to bring the personal experience to the fore is definitely something that all research shows that could be, more can be done, more can be done. My challenge for us, so for the community of people that considers migration, is to learn to do that, not necessarily just emphasizing the identity of the people as migrants, but the identity of people as human beings that have, or as celebrities or innovators that bring an interesting perspective or a personal stories to the fore. I mean, Liverpool is interesting because of Mo Salah, but also because of the manager. Now the name is escaping me. The German. You know what I mean. The German. You can look
Mr. Klopp. Mr. Klopp.
And so I think Liverpool. I think that the whole narrative about the team, including, interesting enough, in the early days on the COVID response. I mean, when Klopp was asked at the press conference, what he thought about stopping the Premier League, he gave a very straight response about how important it was to keep everybody safe and how unimportant football was. And so, which in the UK, having sort of a German, both the European as well as the Egyptian migrant, more or less in the same space, providing an alternative, different, positive narrative that in many ways has nothing to do with the fact that they're from Germany and from Egypt, right? It's about their warmth as human being, their intelligence, their capacity, their empathy, their capacity to engage with the public. So yes, there is scope to do more engagement with the public with migrants who represent, the success or, having achieved something with their lives. But once again, I think that's not enough, or perhaps not even the point, is actually finding a language and a point of connection on things that matter to people, that are not necessarily relating to the reality of migration. And so the labels of campaigns that emphasize, I'm a migrant or the migrant hero, I do think are part of what we need to reconsider, because they do, I think, as you suggest in one of your questions, also, have the potential of fighting back a little bit when you're trying to counteract a negative narrative with a positive one, but fundamentally, using the same rules of engagement rather than leaving that debate about whether a migrant can be good or bad, or migration is a good or bad thing behind, and moving on to what matters to people, which is football, which is fairness, which is keeping safe rather than going to crowded stadiums. And in the context of the COVID recovery, having resilient societies and economies that can see us through these very uncertain times, and the contribution and the skills that everybody can bring to this endeavor, and kind of almost like taking away the attention and the focus to the place where people are born, and to bring in much more to what they're able to do, what they're able to contribute, taxes, skills, human values.
We discussed a lot about communication. You discussed about a distorted narrative, a polarized debate. But if I was a policymaker, why should I care about this? Why should I care about public attitudes? Why should I care about communication? Why should I care about public perceptions? Thus, communication, thus the migration narrative actually has an impact on policymaking when it comes to migration policy.
So this is a bit of a chicken and egg question. So you will have policymakers, but especially politicians, time and time again, especially those that need to stand for election sometime soon, citing public attitudes to migration as a reason for being, either being strict and hostile towards migrants, or at best to ignore the reality of migration altogether. Going back to what we were discussing earlier about the research on public attitudes or political salience of migration, what we know is that public attitudes towards migration tend to be particularly negative around political campaigning and political messages that can fuel anxieties and worries around particularly the mismanagement of migration, rather than being, as we said earlier, entrenched and negative on migration per se. So I think there is, policymakers and politicians, I think, can and should afford a little bit more, flexibility and a bit more of an open mind about these questions, including because the public actually want to be reassured about how this is going to be handled. Now, again, I think the news of the last couple of days from Italy and the reform that is one element of a broader reform package around the recovery from COVID that includes an element of regularization of all irregular migrants in particular sectors is actually an interesting one in that respect, because there you have a politician who is fundamentally who is in charge of agricultural policy rather than home affairs or border control, who has the very specific challenge of sustaining a sector that is in crisis and that is key for the recovery of the country in COVID, where in that particular context, the reality of irregular workers, both migrants, but also natives, Italians, that are, is a reality of the agricultural sector, needs to be addressed and resolved. And so there you have the opportunity of bringing about a significant reforms in terms of regularization of migrants alongside the regularization of other workers, including Italian workers, in a particular sector where there are opportunities and needs in the economy and societies, and the same applies to domestic work and care workers. So again, what would be the opportunity for, or the incentive for somebody standing for, for running a country, to be, political leaders in the next few years on immigration? I don't expect them to be very different. And if anything, I think we will see a backlash in terms of political sort of appetite to be, more flexible when it comes particularly to border controls, given the anxiety that the movement of people is bringing to the management of COVID. On the other hand, I would like to see, and I think there should be spaces for politicians in different sectors, healthcare, agriculture, climate change, anybody who's in charge of youth, to really be much more pragmatic and open-minded about the fact that labor rules and labor policies might need reform in ways that will include the opportunity to integrate better migrant workers. So again, it's a bit of a shift from thinking about how do we find opportunities to amend immigration policy and actually begin to think about the opportunities that might exist in sectoral policies where we have learned through the COVID experience, migrant workers are absolutely key. And from that perspective, the regularization in Italy and in other countries are interesting experiments, however imperfect, but I think go at least in the right direction in terms of creating a different set of incentives for policymakers to engage with this debate from a different standpoint, which is one that relates to sectoral policies and labor regulations. It's also worth remembering that there are different policymakers and politicians that have different priorities. And it strikes me increasingly how mayors and more generally local politicians that lead at the local level have a greater appetite than ever to engage in these debates. Primarily, particularly mayors of large cities, because they live the reality of human mobility inside and between their cities on a day-to-day, and because they need to address the reality of migration as part of urban policies as a matter of practice. And so increasingly we have seen mayors around the world taking steps and exercising leadership in this space, including at the international level. I'm thinking about the way they're working together on climate, but also migration, like the Mayors Migration Councils. We're working with a set of mayors in Europe and Africa, so very much around the Mediterranean region, setting up a dialogue on human mobility. And so there may be opportunities, I think, in the near future to engage more and more directly with local politicians and policymakers on this matter in ways that I think has less constraints than some of the national politicians might have in engaging in this political debate.
So you're talking about a spillover effect, meaning that policies that seem to be strictly related to migration and integration actually have a spillover effect in different other policy areas of a country or a region, yeah, or even a continent, like in the case of the European Union. In relation to this, as we explained, migration is a multifaceted phenomenon that touches upon a variety of policies. But unfortunately, what we've seen in communication trends over the past decade at least, and I'm happy to ask you, since ODI also has a very strong network of communicators worldwide, what we've seen is that communication effectiveness, at least in terms of visibility, is more focused on speed over accuracy. Now, how do you, within your experience and the experience of ODI, communicate effectively and maintain visibility and explain at the same time a phenomenon that requires deep understanding, that is not a black and white phenomenon? You cannot pick sides on migration being good or being bad. It needs extensive knowledge, deep understanding, debate, explanation, in an environment where speed overtakes accuracy for this rat race of visibility. How does ODI work in making sure that all information are communicated appropriately and to the right audience?
I mean, this is obviously is a big dilemma, and it's something that we learn by doing, and we try to adapt as we go along. And I would be the first one to say that in our communications work on migration, I have learned along the way. I mean, I set off to, we as an institution, we began to work more intensely on migration since 2015. And certainly to begin with, I do think that we have, perhaps reacted because of that pressure to, for speed in trying to, always in a bit of a reactive mode, to always trying to counterbalance that negative narrative with a positive one, and insisting on finding rapidly, very touching and positive stories to try to counterbalance the negative narrative. So I think that's a mistake that we need to learn from. I think because, as you said, we've been under pressure for speed, we have ended up sort of playing by the same rules as effectively, the alt-right or the highly nationalist debates that have sort of really manipulated the highly emotional sentiments that people can have about otherness and unknown, and therefore painting the migrant as a representation of the anxieties that people legitimately have in terms of their own future, their own work, and their own insecurity. So I think because of that speed issue, we ended up being in a responsive mode rather than really thinking through an effective way of framing the debate differently. We need to, I think this time around, speed might be on our side, right? In terms that we have seen very rapidly the context changing in the last few weeks, and we've seen there is a moment of opportunity. Of course, it's not going to last long, so we do need to be a little bit quick on our feet, not necessarily to just find the right slogan the way Boris does here, because that clearly doesn't work. We need to find a different framing for the debate, and we need to, as I said earlier, I think is a time to move on from the framing on positive and negative and the good and the bad, and really moving towards a framing of communities and all of us and our collective future. On accuracy, I think that in an attempt to be accurate, we, as in the policy analyst community, have had a very interesting and difficult experience with this field, because for once, we were handling a phenomena where most economists in the world will actually agree. There is this overwhelming sort of economic evidence that migration is ultimately a good thing for societies and economies. You can have debates about how much of a good thing it is. In some cases, might be a bit of, might have mutual effect, but fundamentally, you can find any number of economists tomorrow that will come and do an interview like this and tell you that facts at hand, migration is a terribly good thing for economies all over the world. And so we have used that, that evidence at times to react or to counterbalance some of the negative narratives, which was much more grounded in more emotional framing around people's own values and beliefs and concerns and worries about and uncertainties about their future. And that was a mistake. I think that we made a mistake of using evidence, particularly of an economic nature, to respond to arguments that fundamentally were framed as building on emotions and concerns. It doesn't mean that we should leave behind accuracy and evidence. To the contrary, we should definitely treasure it, and precisely because we have so much evidence in our pockets, in our toolbox that we can share and work with. But we've got to find ways to communicate that evidence in different ways and tailor it to different audiences, as I say. And this is where, if you ask about the experience of ODI, this is where we have, the experience of the last few weeks and months has been moving from a blog that clearly touched, in an early stage, engaged in at the time fairly nascent and new debate that was emerging. So being in a way in the right place at the right time, and then beginning quite fast to collect the evidence, but then turn the evidence into a format that can be shared and can be used and can be evolved over time. And this is where the data visualization that we are working on for the stories of migrant workers come in. And so continuously bring all these elements together. And so to really try to have, to spot the right moment to engage in a conversation with the right tone, and then make sure that, so the evidence is not just collected and that you can repeat it back, but also that you can curate it and use it in ways that can then engage different audiences. So, I'm afraid it's not I think we went through a phase of realizing what we've done wrong with the narrative and the evidence, which has been very much to actually just sort of to use our, the strength of our economic evidence to try to persuade people of things that required, a number of other arguments to be won, to one where we are learning to be not just nuanced, but also to be eclectic and adaptive in the way we reach out to different audiences, and using deliberately different sets of tools, from more traditional research evidence to the communication, and particularly to the visual communication work that we have tried to do in the last couple of years. So it's a bit of a work in progress, but I would return again to this shift in the narrative, and to really, and this is where it gets quite challenging for all of us, and I don't know the answer to it, but my impression is that we've got to talk less about migration. So we've got to take away the emphasis to the reality, or to the characteristics of individuals as migrant, to the phenomenon of the fact that people move from one place to the other, which is something that has been, inevitable, and now is going to become even more challenging, and really put the emphasis on, the real life problems we all share, maintaining levels of services in the health sector, post-Brexit in the UK and post-COVID, for example, or, making sure that the agricultural sector in Italy can survive the shock of COVID, and that, fruits and vegetables are going to be picked next season, and try to use those as entry point for the conversations, rather than, let me try to explain to you why migrants are very good or why migration is a very good thing.
As some of our studies published together with the Observatory on Public Attitudes to Migration from the European University Institute, we would summarize that into reduced salience.
Exactly.
Now, to conclude, Marta, you have over 20 years experience in the field of migration. What would be your main recommendations for communication experts and practitioners covering migration in the Mediterranean for the years to come?
So I've got two recommendations, and they are mostly grounded in the fact that I do have more than 20 years of experience, but not actually on migration policies. I mean, I worked most of my career out on sort of local economic development policies and then international and sort of global development issues. And in fact, I came to migration in the last 5 or 6 years, or as an area of interest. And so I always observed migration a little bit as an outsider, as somebody who's come to this, with a professional and personal experience in grounded in different sectors. And so my two recommendations based on that are the first, the one I mentioned a number of times, is to reframe the debate around us and not them, and to make that, to bring that to the heart of the language we use. It is incredible how much the word migrant can be a shorthand for so many different things. When we're talking about fundamentally people who are born in a country different from the one where they happen to live at this particular time. And so really to take away the emphasis from the definition of migrants, for that matter, and refugees, and all the debates, around the connection or the difference between the two, and much more put the spotlight back on us, on me and you, on us together, and use the fact that there is so much appetite now to reset the conversation, to rethink everything in the world in light of COVID. It couldn't be a more opportune time to reset the narrative on migration away from them and back onto us together. And the second one is less about communication, is a lot more specific to those who work on policy development and advising policymakers and designing policies, to stop treating immigration policy in isolation from the problems that immigration relates to. So to really think about the policies, the sectors that require innovation, that require investment, that require workers, and rethinking the regulations around work, and to consider how the reality of human mobility can interact and become an asset to deliver policy objectives in health, in education, in social protection, where we'll need to rethink the whole world of safety net and social welfare post-COVID or with COVID. And so there is a real opportunity again, as so many policy conversations are starting and are in desperate need for innovative thinking, to bring in the reality of the fact that part of your solution can be found in the pool of workers that happen to be foreign born in a country, in the pool of doctors, for example, that were present in the United States and that were not allowed to work until in a very rapid way in the last few weeks. They've seen state after state removing regulations to allow people to work and contribute to the response to COVID. Or the fact that you may not have enough young people to fulfill new roles, for example, in agriculture in particular countries, that you may not have enough nurses to sustain the National Health Service in the UK once all the European nurses will be gone. And so to really very pragmatically, to some extent even opportunistically, spot where there are sectoral openings, sectoral resets in the policy conversation, where we can bring migration into the picture as a strategy to achieve change, rather than continuously advocating for reform in immigration policies per se, which I frankly see in the next few months is even more challenging than ever before. I think it's going to be terribly difficult in the next few years to argue in favor of more flexible border policies and management. in light of all the additional challenges that COVID has brought to human mobility.
Marta Foresti, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure.